Go. Hello, welcome to my podcast. I'm your host, Larry Lou, and today I'm joined again by Dennis Murphy. And there's a lot of topics that we could go into. And in the pre-conversation, you shared some of those ideas with me. So first, welcome to the podcast.
Glad to be back.
Yeah, so the first point you raised was about Russian coercion. Talk a little bit about the role that Russia has. I suppose you refer to like the information world, like information discourse, because obviously, I
Yeah.
mean, for people who follow the news, there's a hot war that's going on in Eastern Europe that's initiated by Russia against Ukraine, and then in that kind of large scale conflict, there is a direct confrontation that not well between these two countries, but then it's more complicated because the U.S. is backing up Ukraine, as do many of the European countries. So there's effectively a rivalry between U.S. and Russia, and uh, and we've heard about the so-called Russian influence over the years through effectively the prior three presidential election cycles in the U.S. And yeah, so just tell us the state of where we are in this broader conflict, and then specifically on information warfare.
Sure. So I can talk a little bit about what I did. So I worked on a Minerva funded or backed research project that included numerous professors, perhaps a dozen or so research staff spread amongst my school at Georgia Tech, the Samnon School of International Affairs, and their applied research arm, the university's applied research arm, the Georgia Tech Research Institute. So I was working on a project there for 2 years, centered around Russian coercion. The basic idea behind it was that we were trying to map the landscape of the ways in which Russia might have tried to alter the media landscape and try to connect those with certain markers of change in the coercive relationship. This started prior to the invasion. So the idea was to unpack how countries engage in strategic competition. But after the invasion took place, it rapidly transitioned into trying to understand whether or not shaping of a media environment could presage influences or factors on the ground to see whether or not certain statements being made were indicators of on the ground conflict or international coercive practices. So we spent a lot of time looking at different types of media sources. We took a look at Putin's statements directly. There's been a lot of focus on red line statements. There is an entire academic war and practitioner war about whether or not you take red lines seriously. Um, uh, and then there was parallel effort related to trying to see whether or not you could use large databases of news media. So GDELT is one of the larger open source databases. So it gathers together metadata of almost every newspaper and online media source. And when these newspaper or online media sources are taken and or captured, they are then assigned certain codes and tags, and we were trying to model those over time. So we made a few models. We did a lot of work, some of which was fruitful. Some of the more surprising things was while we were trying to take a look into how text data or media might be playing a role on side of the battlefield. What we instead found was some of the other stuff that we included inside of our model, because we were taking a look at a bunch of different variables, was that oil prices were a very statistically significant factor for battlefield deaths fading 2, 3 weeks out. It wasn't a large number, it was just statistically significant. So that was interesting.
Well,
And
could
then
you
when we were
explain
taking a look,
that relationship between battle deaths and oil prices?
oh yeah, so the oil market was was one of the more powerful indicators of Russian military movements or actions that led to detectable battlefield deaths. We also need to be careful. Um, Battlefield deaths that we are aware of is not the same thing as battlefield deaths in total. There's still a large degree of ambiguity about those numbers because even to this date, we still don't necessarily know how many people Russia lost or how many people Ukraine lost. It was just that for the time period in question that we were taking a look at, oil prices signified more intense battlefield conditions with higher casualty rates fading 2, 3 weeks out. So that was one of the things that we came across. One of the more interesting bits have been trying to understand how red lines are used ever since the conflict started having a serious potential to escalate. So I know this is pretty old hat for people who have been paying attention to the conflict when it first came out. The war is past its birthdays, but early on in the conflict, there was a very strong attempt to do something that is sometimes referred to as intra-war deterrence. So I'm going to unpack that because it's a very academic-y, jargony term that doesn't make a lot of sense to people outside of academia or the Department of Defense. Deterrence is the notion that we are trying to prevent another actor from doing something. So we deter aggression. We deter an actor not to do a certain type of thing. And deterrence is an increasingly all-encompassing element of how the United States approaches defense matters and strategy. There was a recent article that John Lindsay and Eric Gartsky put out talking about how it's sort of a euphemism now for just strategy, trying to get other actors to do what we want them to do. But putting aside the conceptual debate, the basic idea was that we try to manage how countries escalate with one another so that we don't want things to increasingly ratchet up as far as tensions are concerned, leading to some type of overall conflict. So we're very careful about that. Deterrence is usually talked about in a pre-war setting, but after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there's been more increased focus on the notion of intra-war deterrence or deterrence within warfare, which is how do you prevent a battle or a operation or a theater or the entire war itself from escalating out of control. So Russia is inside of Ukraine. It is invading. This is a hot war. We aren't talking about the lack of escalation as far as the war is concerned, but instead what we're talking about is how different actors have been trying to prevent the war in Ukraine from spiraling out of control, either internally to Ukraine or externally among neighboring countries. So preventing potential European or NATO involvement. And one of the things that we've seen is that actors have been trying to prevent an overall escalation. So this has to do with lots of times Ukraine would request certain types of military equipment, and it would be provided months later, usually after battlefield conditions or operational conditions had changed. So like there have been requests for aircraft for forever, but now aircraft of certain classes of aircraft have only just started to go into Ukraine. Same thing with different types of military operations, different types of military assistance. HIMARS is another example of that to an extent. The basic idea was that aid was being provided to Ukraine to fight the war that it had, but it was done so in a way that the conditions wouldn't spill over. And one of the reasons why we were a little bit anxious about providing too much assistance. This is not too controversial, by the way. There are people that will highly dispute what I'm saying, but there are a large number of people that will tell you that Ukraine, for the first year of the conflict, was always getting what it asked for. Too late for it to result in increased Ukrainian momentum as far as the conflict was concerned. So yeah, one of the reasons why is Russian red lines. And these things are something that is an entire academic debate. It filters into the information space. It filters into how we even conceive of the conflict itself, which is how far can Ukraine or NATO push before Russia fights back in a way that escalates the conflict,
Through
potentially
nuclear
through
weapons.
these. Yep. Nuclear weapons is the big one. It is not the only one, but nuclear weapons is the big threshold. How do we prevent Russia from using a nuke? Um, Early on, now today, not a lot of people are too concerned about that, but early on, people were terrified of it. People were fundamentally terrified of a potential escalation because very few people, while the US intelligence community became very confident of a Russian invasion of Ukraine, a large number of policymakers, particularly policymakers inside of Europe, doubted that there would be a war. Zelensky even said that there was rhetoric that was hyping up the chance of a conflict and that everyone needed to calm down like a month before the invasion. So, I mean, people were initially skeptical of a hot war. And then once a hot war happened, it was all about, okay, what do we do to prevent this war from going all the way, going nuclear? This is the first time that we're seeing a nuclear power invade a country right against NATO. And NATO was actively assisting that country through the use of provisions of wartime supplies. We were very, very, very cautious about that. So Russian red lines, oftentimes, whenever they started to lose or whenever conditions started to become unfavorable to them, or whenever NATO was threatening to do something that they didn't like, there would be a red line type statement. Now, there are explicit red lines, there are implied red lines, there are implicit red lines. There's an entire taxonomy of this stuff. I don't want to bore your audience too much into it. But let's just say that Russia, in particular, Vladimir Putin, and the people underneath him had utilized rhetoric that threatened escalation, in particular, potential escalations against, if not Ukraine, then potentially NATO, uh, as a way to manage what we can call an escalation ladder. So the basic idea is that red line statements were given at points of escalation, and it was usually to threaten Russian escalation as a way to make the US or NATO back down from some type of potential position, be it supplying certain types of tanks, certain types of fighter aircraft, certain types of defense systems. There would be some statement along those lines, and then there would be some type of Russian counterreaction. Very early on in the conflict, this was something that a lot of people cared about and took very, very seriously. Over the past year or so, we've seen the people who took red lines very seriously start to look like they're a little bit more tentative about it, whereas the people who are highly skeptical of it basically say that red lines don't matter at all. Some of the way to approach this is that the only thing that red lines really do is ensure that certain types of assistance, aid, or support ends up getting delayed 3, 4, 5, 6 months. And at that point, if it's just a delaying action, why not just do it at first? So there are a lot of people looking into this. Adam Stolberg, chair of my school, is very much researching red lines. Sam Cherep over at RAMD also did red lines. And of course, the trifecta that get a lot of support from the community that focuses on the Ukraine war. So this is like Michael Kaufman, Dara Massacott, Rob Lee. Those people more indirectly have talked about red lines. I mean, red lines is part of what they do, but it's not their main focus. So everyone talks about this stuff. And now it seems like red lines are something that increasingly people don't focus nearly as much about, like the counter invasion of Ukrainian forces inside of Russia. That's something that would have been considered a red line earlier on in the conflict. Sending over of F-16s would have been one of those. And we're entering into the point where so many red lines have been crossed that people doubt whether or not the red lines had meaning. There is a slight change in that. So, I mean, there are people that would instead argue that a red line statement is a way to temporarily stabilize battlefield conditions in a way that, in forcing a certain delay on NATO support for Ukraine, it gives Russia a chance to cool down a little bit. Perhaps the right way to take a look at this is salami slicing tactics, which is usually it's referred to in a defensive manner, as in an adversary is engaging in salami slicing tactics, slowly, slowly pushing back thresholds and barriers that we would be willing to accept. So, uh, like during the Cold War, the idea when would the United States go to war with the Soviet Union? Would we go to war if there was increased coercion inside of East Berlin? I mean, West Berlin, maybe not. If there was increased hardening the line, maybe not. If there were military exercises that crossed into certain parts of Western Germany, maybe not. But if you just slowly ratchet that up, you can end up getting to the point of, oh, uh, they conquered France. Do we go to war? And I mean, the obvious answer is, of course, yeah. But if you tell a story of 1,000 paper cuts, then maybe we don't get to that point, even if it does result in what is certainly a localized war. Red lines might serve a similar purpose, which is if an F-16 was given to Ukraine day one, that might have resulted in some type of escalation into NATO that hadn't taken place prior. But since that it's happening now, we are well into the conflict. Battlefield conditions have somewhat stagnated. If anything, in some ways it's negative for Ukraine, and in other ways it's positive for Ukraine. So, in a way, it's sort of stagnated. It's well into the course of the conflict. We've gotten to the point where people have acculturated to certain amounts of micro escalations, so that now the F-16 results in a lot of sound and fury, but it signified very little as far as Russian escalation is concerned. So, I mean, that's the overall tenor of the stuff that we've been doing, or rather had been doing. It's been about a year since I've worked extensively on that project. Could be that they have more exciting things to report, but yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and what makes the red line research so difficult ultimately is that, none of the Western experts that you cited, can do mind reading in Putin's head, which is ultimately what you would have to do if you wanted to conclusively answer the question about how serious red lines are.
Mhm.
But I would take the Zelensky argument quite seriously, where he claims that the Kursk incursion shows that the red line is hollow, because the original red line that Putin formulated at the beginning of the war, right? He was flashing the nuclear weapons in the first few days after the invasion, and he said if there was any material threat to the territory of the Russian Federation, then we're going to use the nukes, and that red line was clearly crossed at this point, and now the Ukrainians are trying to convince the Americans to allow them to use the long range missiles in on Russian territory, which I think, I mean, like, look, I mean, if you fight a war, um and you want to win it, right, then you don't want to tie one hand behind the back, right? I mean, you actually want to destroy the capabilities of Russia to basically organize further strikes into Ukrainian territory. Now, the interesting thing that has happened, I believe, so you saw the headline about the missile drone that Ukraine unveiled, and it's about creating um, longer range strike capabilities. Um, and I saw that, I think, in Omsk, which is one of the largest petroleum refineries in Russia, which is, I believe, it's more than 1,000. I think it's 1,400 kilometers from the front line. Has been targeted by very long range Ukrainian drones. And so I do think that the Ukrainians, they are going to be more and more capable of developing these kinds of long range strike capabilities. Um, but I think that again, I think the Zelensky argument, I think, is correct that that Putin is not going to risk a nuclear war. Um, even if his own territory is being struck. Um, I think he might even be okay to um, lose, I suppose, some of the buffer zone around Kursk Oblast. Um, because if you look at the other part of the front, like in Donetsk, right, where the Russians are still pushing forward. They're very close to Pokrovsk, and which is a big supply hub for Ukraine and the Donbass. Clearly, I mean, there is a political objective to seize all of Donetsk, and and he still keeps going, even if his own territory is under threat. And then it does create a very big question, which maybe none of us two can answer that, but um, was the Ukrainian military leadership wise in their decision to attack Kursk? Um, because I mean the whole expectation is that Russia would have to stop the Donbass offensive and would have to redeploy some troops in the Kursk direction. Um, but I mean, but if this was not happening, then okay, then we have risk on both sides, right? So the risk of Ukraine losing all of Donetsk, and
Mhm.
it's certainly the risk of the Russians that they might lose some more territory in Kursk or in other border regions. Um, but yeah, it's just a big unknown um, factor. Um, and certainly, I mean, so and then below the threshold of nuclear escalation, I think Putin has already pulled all of the registers that he can pull, in my view. So, like the big missile strike on major Ukrainian cities, the attacks on the infrastructure, the power stations, and basically making civilian life intolerable. Um, so I think, I mean, yeah, below the nuclear threshold, I mean, he's already doing everything that he can, and so versus I think that the West has significant arsenal and capabilities uh, that they did not bring forward. Um, like the number of, I don't know, Abrams tanks or various fighter jets that are quite frankly carrying dust in the U.S. Right? So I think yeah, there are capabilities that can be brought forward. But yeah, but I know there's different views on it. There's people who say
Yeah.
that we should sacrifice Ukraine and maybe hopefully this will stop the war. Right?
So there is almost endless debate about whether or not Russia's capabilities have been maxed out. I will say that people have been saying that Russia's capability has been maxed out for about a year or so. Some were even saying it even earlier. I don't know how I feel about that. So I can understand where it's coming from. Very early on, people were talking about Russian escalation, and the question was like, what? They'll bomb more? They'll recruit from more prison cells? What is this more that we're talking about? But I'll just say that just because we don't necessarily imagine the pathways that there could be further escalation doesn't mean that there can't be. especially if we're thinking about escalation outside of the zone of active contention. So, yeah, Russia's red line with regards towards invasion of Russian territory resulting in nuclear war clearly passed, as in like that's not true anymore. But it's worth asking the roadblocks that led to that to talk about the degree to which this was salami sliced. So there were air incursions for a while. There was some artillery incursions. There was a short-term incursion on the ground prior to the most recent push. It just didn't result in, I believe, any permanent ground gained. So it wasn't as if it was just boom, an invasion. It was instead battlefield conditions were treated, and the people in charge of the battlefield, the people who manage conflict, were slowly acculturated to the idea that Russian territory bordering Ukraine was vulnerable to some type of action. And yeah, there's also airborne penetrative strikes that are much further in than where we're seeing Ukrainian boots on the ground. Question is, does that mean suddenly everything is fair game? I don't I don't quite buy that. Now, I will say that there are plenty of people that do, or oddly enough, there are plenty of people that did. So there was a retired person who used to work on the NSC that I was having coffee with like a year and a half ago. Their response was, what we should have done was invite Ukraine into NATO and then just push everything there to make a very strong show of force so that Putin wouldn't invade. And that instead it was just a mixture of support for Ukraine without any willingness to put European or American lives at risk, which was the thing that was seen as sort of a green light. Um, so, I mean, people talk about things, but I have to imagine that if that were the case, and then there was some incursion inside of the territory of Western Russia, that could very easily just escalate and spiral out of control. Even right now, a lot of the presence taking place inside of Ukraine is often misconstrued inside of the Russian media in the first place, such that a very large number of Russian soldiers, when they're in Ukraine, think they're fighting NATO forces. I don't know how exactly they're justifying that domestic narrative
Well,
without
they're
also,
fighting the legionnaires, so you do have some Western mercenaries that are fighting on behalf of the Ukrainian army, right?
well, I mean, there are definitely personnel there. There are also people who train. I'm thinking more so the idea that it is seen as a NATO type war that is occasionally brought up inside of Russian media. That's always a little bit more tricky and dubious to me because the more they hype up the idea that they're currently already engaged in hostilities with NATO, the more you have to ask what's restraining their own actions towards targeting NATO infrastructure or NATO systems or NATO personnel. Um, so I mean, it's this weird situation. It's all ambiguous. There are people that have been. There are a lot of people who stake their career on claiming to know what was going on in the first year of the conflict, and the people that did either don't have careers anymore or have learned to adjust how they talk about the conflict. So it's it's a bit difficult. I remember about a year ago talking about rates of supply and munitions to be given to Ukraine. So the defense industrial base. Does the United States or NATO have a lot of hardware they can send over to Ukraine? Yeah. Can that hardware be used sustainably and in high intense conflicts for years? No, no. Um,
So you're
one of
talking
the
about
larger,
artillery barrels that go bust after using that for a long time.
no, I'm talking about running out of shells for the
Running
artillery.
out of shells. Okay.
So we're talking about stockpiles of munitions. That's been a chronic problem in Ukraine, but it's not just a problem in Ukraine. It was a problem here. We gave out our excess stock, and then suddenly there were a lot of people asking, well, if there's a war tomorrow with someone else and we need all these bullets, how long can we sustain a conflict? So one of the things that's been going on in the American approach to warfare has been towards ever increasingly exquisite systems, which just means expensive, ever more expensive systems. And the more expensive your system, it's not just the platform, it's not just the tank, it's not just the airplane, it's also their missiles, it's also their shells, it's also the bullets. So the more expensive the equipment, it's not exactly a one-to-one correlation. Usually, the more expensive it is to actually use them. And there have been some people that said, and now there have been some people I've encountered that have said that, say, in a Taiwan scenario, most of the local munitions might be expended in a month or two. And then there's very little left. They think that's the same thing for China. And let's just say that there are a large number of people that, one, they're worried that they're going to run out of the ability to sustain high intensity conflict operations because they're going to run out of munitions. Second, they're also worried that a lot of the platforms might be more vulnerable than we think, and we don't exactly want to put them at risk to allow adversaries the chance to take shots at them to figure out how to break them. And there's also a couple of other things at play. But let's just say that the war in Ukraine actually was a wake-up call for a lot of people. So there's now been a large push to increase munitions. It's not hard to find articles about either the European Union or the United States focusing on rebuilding a defense industrial base capable of sustained high-intensity operations. And I mean, Ukraine is a big country, and the front is a big front. But the types of future wars that people in the Pentagon sometimes think about are a lot bigger sometimes. So the fact that it's actually sort of difficult to sustain that conflict with munitions was enough to scare people a lot into making a lot of changes. And the funny thing is, before we started worrying about our ability to sustain the operations, like 4 months into the conflict, we were convinced that Russia would run out of shells, that they would run out of bullets. They were going to run out of manpower, or they were going to run out of bullets, or they were
Well,
going
they
to
did
run out of
receive
money.
6 million shells from North Korea, right? I mean,
They
that
did
was
get a lot of
important.
stuff from North Korea. They also got a lot of stuff from other countries as well. They
Iran.
raided warehouses in Belarus, for instance. And they also developed partnerships with Iran to build their own drones. And while they are not quite getting direct military supplies from China, there's a lot of pre-military supplies, the types of supplies that will then be used to build weapons of war. So they've completely revamped their defense industrial base. Russia went from, we need to basically use 60, 70-year-old junk from North Korea to, oh, we need to actually really build a whole bunch of stuff. And now they're actually very surprisingly sustainable and enduring. A year ago, that would have taken a lot of people by surprise. Maybe not a year ago, a year and a half ago, that would have taken a lot of people by surprise. And then afterwards, we started having our own panics about whether or not we could sustain that. In fact, someone said, oh, look, these HIMARS are really good. Can we get more of them? And it turns out that the waiting time to build more HIMARS was not to be measured in months, but to be measured in years. So we're talking about a relatively slow plan. And we're aware of it. We have been aware of it. This is old news for a lot of people that have actually really been nothing but focused on Ukraine. So, I mean, a lot of people are talking about revamping a lot of the ways in which we do munitions. A lot of people are starting to think whether or not the focus on more expensive systems is a mistake. It doesn't really matter if you have the best system, if it can't be used for a long time. So instead, the approach is changing towards large amount of attritable stuff, i.e. stuff that we could blow up and lose. A lot of people are taking a look at the war in Ukraine as a way to learn lessons about future drone uses in conflict. And there was a recent program that was announced and is now public focusing on replicators, the replicator program that the United States is trying to push forward, which is just taking that lesson to the max, like how you can have cheap, attritable, enduring, cost-effective ways to go to war in the future. So a lot of people are focusing on changing that, but some of this stuff is not now. It's stuff that can be made soon. So a lot of people are still worried about the ability to sustain military operations. And a lot of people are also uncomfortable with giving away too much of our newer stuff that would then need to take most of our newer munitions. So it's a delicate balance. Let's just say that right now things have pushed and they have pulled. And the Ukraine conflict is now increasingly one where people just surrender to trends. There's this idea that there will be no more surprises. There will be no red lines that result in large escalations. And in a sense, it is now a numbers game. It is how many inches can you take on the ground? And what is the price for those inches in gallons of blood and millions of dollars on munitions? And people just try to stack those three things together to come up with some type of abstract model for when the war will end or how the war might end. And then those flows, because all this is a flow model, then those flows are then put up against political will of policymakers. So whether or not the Kremlin can sustain this, turns out probably it can. The war has actually been relatively good as far as wages are concerned for poorer Russians. There was some economic data that showed that there was some wage growth. Now, I don't know how that compares to pre-war levels. This is just recently. Recently, there's been some increases. Their economy is also increasingly geared towards war. I forget the exact percentage of GDP, but it is a very large number of their current GDP is focused on war. So, I mean, will that be sustainable or enduring? Lots of people have said no, but they've said no now since almost the first crossing. So who knows? Um, then there's also the question of whether or not NATO can continue to support Ukraine. If we were talking about year one, the issue would have been Europe. Europe's not doing enough. Now that we are not in year one anymore, the question is whether or not just Europe, but the United States and all of NATO can continue to sustain the war in Ukraine. And it's gotten to the point where there are a couple of practitioners, including a few four-star generals that have entered into retirement, that say things like the war will end according to the policymakers in Washington deciding when it will end, i.e., um, either the current president or a future president at some situation will just decide to cut the plug uh, and pull the plug, rather, cut the flow. And then afterwards, the war will need to have some type of arranged settlement. Um, we don't necessarily know what that will look like. There have been people talking about sacrificing Ukraine. There have been people talking about recent battlefield flows suggesting that Ukraine could take everything back. There's been some notion that the reason why there is a desire to hold territory in Russia is so that in a negotiating position, they could give up Russian territory to get back more of their territory. It's all sort of up in the air. There's also a recent leak. I don't know. I have no special insight into whether or not this is accurate, but there seemed to be some initial negotiations that would have suggested that Zelensky might have been willing to cede territory early on in the conflict until that avenue was closed. So maybe that'll be what we turn to. It'll also depend whether or not we see Harris or Trump in the White House come January. And then there's all these black swan, unknown type things where people think that the war is all about mapping up flow charts and crunching numbers. But it could be that some unknown X factor results in the complete collapse of support inside of Russia or inside of Europe,
Yeah,
which is
I
a very
mean,
nice way of saying it's all up in the air and I don't really know.
yeah, none of us know. I mean, but I would say that like if I was looking at it from the Ukrainian perspective, and I'm obviously favorable and biased in favor of them. That I
We
mean,
all are.
I would only accept, um, the you could say concession of territory to Russia, if there was a pathway into NATO for what you might call the free Ukraine or Western Ukraine, similar to the West and East Germany model, right? Where, I mean, Germany did not restore full sovereignty until 1990, uh, and West Germany joined NATO in 1955, I want to say. And if there was a similar model, I think that yeah, I mean, could you force Putin to accept it? Well, I mean that's ultimately, I think, not up to him, right? I think this is really the collective decision of NATO, where they are like, well, we're going to stand behind this sort of NATO expansion, um, and then um, and then what's going to be the final status of Ukraine? Well, you would have to wait until there's going to be some internal political change in Russia, where they might say, well, okay, maybe this, you know, uh, seizing Donbass and eastern southern Ukraine thing, is not important to the Russian identity, and and we're going to allow for the full restoration of sovereignty in Ukraine. It would certainly not happen under the Putin regime, but it would be an opening that can be explored for later. Now, but my guess is that that the U.S. administration, and then by extension the European governments who follow the American argument, are not willing to consider this option, and and then as well, as a Ukrainian leader, I would say, well, okay, then I'll just have to fight for as long as I can. I mean, essentially until you know until what? Until Kiev is threatened again? Perhaps, I don't know. I mean, in a way, I mean, because they're perceiving it to be, a fight for national survival. Um, a- and and then if I look at it from the Central European perspective, I mean, which is where I'm from, um, I would interpret the U.S. retreat from Ukraine altogether, um, to be a very terrible message, um, because it means that, well, I mean, firstly, that the Europeans will definitely spend more money on defense. That effectively, I mean, the NATO alliance, um, at the very least, is weakened. If not, you know, de facto abolished. And Yeah, and so it means that, from the European angle, you're kind of like, well, okay, if the US is not backing us militarily, then why should we not try to be friendly with Russia? Why should we not be friendly with China? And there's going to be nothing that will hold us back. I mean, you could make the argument, well, there's democracy versus autocracy. There might be value differences, etc. Um, but I mean, rationally, I mean, if I was a European leader, I would say that the whole point of staying within the U.S. column, is that they would provide continued military protection, and if they're not doing it, um, then why not try to develop partnerships with the U.S. adversaries, right? Uh,
So I get where you're coming from with that, but I think I think NATO support for Ukraine has somewhat muddied the waters a little bit in the sense that Ukraine is not NATO, at least not yet. So the idea that the United States might at some point just withdraw support from Ukraine, there are there are a large number of people that say that that would have a negative effect on Europe as far as the US European relationship is concerned, but it wouldn't necessarily lead to the abolishment of NATO. Um, in large part explicitly because Ukraine isn't NATO. It is a NATO friendly country. It is receiving NATO support, but it's like Georgia, which was invaded by Russia before this happened, like
It is
15 years
still in
ago.
the Russian sphere of influence, and the U.S. accepts that
Sort
situation.
of, sort of. There's Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Georgia is a continuously torn country, but there's still a lot of aspirations for Europe. It's more so the European aspiration was killed because
By the
of the
Georgian
Russian
leader.
intervention. Yeah. So now it's just hard. For Ukraine, though, Europe is something. So the European Union has made a lot of very positive noises about future Ukrainian involvement. Um, but that's the thing, future. Uh, so I think a lot of people would want to include Ukraine into NATO and the European Union, just stitch together the transatlantic partnership permanently at that point. Welcome into the great cohorts of nations that everything that is good and just and beautiful in the world love, apparently. But it is tricky as things currently stand because those are all future aspirations. And one of the things that I'm increasingly worried about is that should there be a collapse of political will to support Ukraine, either in the United States or Europe, both are possible, while the conflict is still hot, the temptation might be to continue on the conflict until they have no other choice. But that's bad for two reasons. It's always better to try to negotiate for some type of settlement when there is room to maneuver. If you wait until you have no other choice, then there is no room to maneuver. But the second problem is how much will it cost to rebuild Ukraine? And that is a scarily large number, a very large number. And it might be more than the total cost of the war itself thus far. It might even be larger, depending on how things actually go, especially since we're talking about repurposing infrastructure away from Russia, because I mean, a lot of Ukraine's old economy was geared towards the old Soviet world. It was starting to push towards Europe, but a lot of its legacy stuff was geared towards Russia. A lot of its infrastructure certainly was. It was a main pipeline access point between Russia and Europe, for instance. Now it would need to fundamentally reinvent itself so that it is geared towards Europe. And the willingness to do trade with Russia is probably something that won't be high on the priority list of Zelensky or whoever replaces him. And someone will eventually replace him. I mean, it's a democratic country. And we're going to enter into the realm of ordinary politics. Ordinary politics and a post war Ukraine that is insufficiently supported economically will be politically unstable and it will have a lot of weapons. Politically unstable, economically disenfranchised, heavily armed pocket of Europe. I think that absolutely everything possible should be done to support a successful reconstruction and incorporation of Ukraine into Europe in the post war scenario. Because I don't think that there's been enough effort into the post war scenario. Now, there have been a few people who've done it. I'm not going to pretend like no one's taking a look at it. In fact, I had a sort of conversation with Howard Schatz at RAND a few months ago. And he was one of the authors on a big report on reconstruction of Ukraine after the war. But there's a lot of, and this is personal. I'm not representing any institutional opinions at the moment. Earlier, I was mostly just giving out what other people thought. This one is me. I am concerned about an insufficiently supported reconstruction effort inside of Ukraine. I am concerned about an insufficient reintegration campaign. I'm concerned about a heavily armed, heavily bombed, heavily mined Ukraine's frontier, a lot of its arable farmland is among the most heavily mined land on planet Earth. It's surpassed Southeast Asia. For the people who remember anything about bombs in Southeast Asia blowing up and places where people were told not to go because one wrong move might get you killed, that should sound some pretty strong alarm bells. So, I mean, I'm concerned because I think a lot of people are increasingly apathetic about the conflict, increasingly adjusted to the idea of some type of forced settlement at some point, and Ukraine increasingly fading from view as a political issue that people will care about. And I think that if the post war scenario isn't handled well, we could potentially end up resulting in a very adverse scenario for Ukraine in the future.
Yeah, I
And
would
that's
say,
about all I'll say.
I mean, at this point, I mean, talking about reconstruction of Ukraine is quite premature because you have to first convince the actors in the battleground to stop shooting. I mean, and so, so, you know, getting to that point, I mean, if there was a diplomatic route, and you know,
Mhm.
then I would support that, and I've already, you know, described, you know, basically the territory for NATO membership plan as a potential way to stop the conflict ASAP. But yeah, but again, you know, it still presupposes that there is a willingness in both the Ukrainian and the Russian leadership to to get to that outcome. And if that is not the case, then I think from the Western angle, so both the European and the American, that I think that military supplies should be given. And I mean, it's essentially, I mean, it's a waiting game, right? Because I do believe that, I mean, the way how you presented the Russian war economy as being able to, you know, hold on this fight for, you know, I don't know, really, really long time. I have a very hard time believing that statement. I think that you know, yeah, I think that the West has the resources and could sustain, you know, the war for much longer than Russia can. Yeah, I mean, surely, I mean, there's going to be discomforts that we will impose in the supply chains. Maybe inflation will be elevated for some time. So I'm not saying it's going to be pretty for, you know, the Western taxpayers. But I'm much more concerned about a potentially victorious Russia and what this could mean for the security of
Europe.
Europe at the very least.
Yeah.
And so I think that that the rational thing of the Western countries is to keep going. And then of course, I mean, the message to the Ukrainians is that, you know, I would say to them, well, I mean, you're going to keep fighting for as long as you know, as you want to, really. I mean, so because there's always this argument by the Westerners that the Ukrainians, that the Westerners are the puppet masters, right? The Ukrainians are the ones that then are the puppet, you know, dance according to the tune. And I'm like, you know, I have a very hard time accepting that logic too. You know, because if you consider, you know, the Afghan administration, right? The guy after Hamid Karzai, what was Ghani,
Yeah.
Ashraf
Got it.
Ghani, right?
Yeah.
And you know, if you called him an American puppet who was stealing a lot of the American aid money for his own benefit, he wasn't paying, you know, the Afghan army soldiers who then readily defected to the Taliban. Um, I, 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 I think it would be a much more convincing narrative to me that that you have an incompetent American puppet, I suppose, that was running the pro US regime. Um, yeah, but in Ukraine, I just have a much harder time believing in that. You know, I think that there were insufficient Western military aid to Ukraine, and yet they were still, fighting as hard as they could to push the Russians out of Kiev. Um, so I think this is, the internal narrative for the Ukrainians is, I mean, well, we're fighting a battle for national independence, and I have, and I have no reason to doubt their narrative, right? And so, and if that is the case, then yeah, I would say that, what if the escape option for the war is going to be a Prigozhin style uprising? Why is it not, in the realm of possibilities? Um, you know, you remember when Prigozhin, so he stopped the march, um, in Tula Oblast, and Putin released a video where he was saying, don't you remember what happened to Tsar Nicholas II? That, during at the end of World War I, or I mean, I guess for the Eastern Front, um, the Bolsheviks basically took advantage of the, Russian army weakness, and they convinced the Petrograd sailors to join them in the uprising against the Tsar. And then the Tsar was assassinated by the Bolshevik regime. And I find it quite interesting that Putin, in his, oftentimes selective readings of history, was choosing to compare himself with Nicholas II, um, because I thought that the metaphor was quite apt, to be quite frank. I mean, I mean, effectively, I mean, if you keep pushing the Russian people, you step on the throat. Yes, I mean, coercion can be quite effective, and it has been for the last, 2.5 years, and I think it will continue to be quite effective for a while. But it's not endless. I mean, even just within the Russian history, um, there will be enough resistance at some point. I mean, it's not happening now for sure. Um, but I would say that, yeah, the anti-Putin rebellion. I mean, it has to be on the cards, um, and if the negotiated settlement is not realistic at this point, right?
Sure. So, I mean, if we're talking about whether or not there could be some type of X factor, some type of black swan that could disrupt the course of the war, I think that that's right. I think that a little bit too often now, there's this overall assumption that the conflict is essentially a flow model. It's like a bathtub. You can just run some numbers on it, and eventually you'll figure out who will lose first. But yeah, I won't really say too much more on this topic. Ukraine is different from Afghanistan, of course. Um, there were also very different wars. So one was an insurgency. This one's a very conventional conflict. So I mean, disanalogies are there. But as far as the conflict is concerned, if we expect one side to break first, if this is continuous, will it be Russia? Probably. Yeah. I would put my money on Russia breaking a hell of a lot sooner than I would put my money on NATO breaking. But I think there's a difference between breaking because you can't do it and just simply losing political will. And one of the things I'm a little bit nervous about is how enduring political will be, especially since there is some reason to doubt that. Thankfully, not in Europe at the moment. Certain parts of Europe, of course, but Ursula von der Leyen has been very clear on this. And she just recently gained her second term. And there's been lots of broad support inside of the major European democracies. So, I mean, most of the major players are behind this at this stage. So for now, I think that that's perfectly fine.
Well,
But
Germany is a wild card, I would say, because they have a libertarian finance minister, and he said that
well, I mean,
the military
Schultz's
aid will be
traffic
cut in
light is
half.
starting to fall apart. That is true. The traffic light is down, more or less. I do feel a little bit better though because the AFD seems to be undercut a little bit by Wagenknecht, or whatever her name
Right.
is. Yeah. So I mean, like the Der Linke offshoot seems to be competing for the same types of voters in similar types of regions. So the German wild card just isn't it? Well, I mean, I'm going to start speaking beyond my competency here, but doesn't it seem more like it's the CDU that would probably run away from that one?
Yeah, well, the reason why Wagenknecht and also the AfD is so popular with respect to the foreign policy views, which you might call, Russia accommodationist, right?
Yep,
I think it has to do with, um, you know, f well, there's two emotional states. I think the one is about fear of Russia, where they lived under the Soviet occupation, and yeah, and they kind of developed this, um, I suppose, deferential attitude towards the Russian overlords, which interestingly is quite opposite to like the Polish way of thinking, because they also lived under the Soviet occupation, but they are very much anti-Russian. Um, and also, and the second way of thinking in East Germany is about kind of like anti-Western, like anti-NATO, anti-US way of thinking, which um, is also kind of well developed. I mean, probably again having to do with that history, right? So, okay, we stood on the other side of the Berlin Wall, and yeah, and so those kinds of motivations, the anti-Western, pro-Russian, I don't know, uh, it kind of explains some of that, um, popularity, perhaps, of the pro-Russian position, right? Um, yeah, but I mean, Wagenknecht, AfD are not in the federal government and power. So really, I think the FDP view is the important one, because they're saying that, well, we have to do budget austerity, right? That they've been running up the national credit card during COVID, during the Ukraine crisis, and now is the time to consolidate the budget again. Um, and yeah, well, I mean, the problem with like the libertarian perspective, I mean, it's not just defense spending. I think they want to they want to do cuts in all kinds
basically
of social
everything.
programs. Yeah, that's right. Drowning government in the bathtub. Um, and and I think that's sort of like pure focus on like domestic politics, to the exclusion of like national security interests, where I mean, like, look, I mean, I consider myself like a lefty, like very close to Bernie Sanders, right? But I would make the argument that you cannot think about any of the social programs, unless you have the national defense securely established. Um, it's like, I mean, if you live in a world where, this Hobbesian world where the powerful neighbor is going to attack you, is going to threaten your national security, um, then, do you have to do guns and butter? I mean, I suppose, yeah. I
We're
mean,
going back to LBJ at this point, but yeah, yeah.
yeah,
So, I mean, is that a concern? Yeah. Part of me doesn't think it's as existential, but if we're talking about short-term disruptions, then yeah, yeah, that could be a very immediate short-term disruption right now. And now you'll know German internal politics a lot better than me for very good reason. You can speak German, right?
yeah, yeah, yeah.
You
Just
have
to
you have a
listen to the
history. You
discourse.
have a history from Europe, right?
Yeah. So I, yeah, went to the
Lots of time
schools
in
there.
Vienna, right?
Yeah, I spent time in Vienna, and it's definitely worthwhile going there, for people vacationing, and also quality of life there is very high. Um, and but there's a concern with migration now. I mean, I think it's the same discourse that you find in every Western country at this point, right? I mean, it's the
Yeah,
same
it's
discourse because
balance.
yeah, I mean, because in a way, so in terms of the regular migration policy, right? Like, that is to say, like work visa, student visas, and those sorts of things, and family reunification. I mean, there's a certain cap, right, that the government imposes, and I don't think that the governments in the Western countries have changed those laws much at all. But the thing that has changed is that the so-called, like, undocumented or illegal migration, depending on what you want political affiliation is, um, that has increased substantially. Um, in both in Europe as well as in the U.S. and Canada, um, and it it does produce a significant amount of backlash. I mean, so you have a fairly liberal government even in Canada, um, and they are now backpedaling as well, right? They're seeing that the conservatives are probably going to win a blowout election victory, and so they're like, okay, well, now we also want to close the border for especially so-called low skill migration. Um, and yeah, and then in similar discourses are happening, all over Europe as well. There's a lot of anxiety that, oh, there's too much migration, and also, like, the fact that, I mean, so the labor market, I think, is quite good. So even for native people, I think it is possible to obtain jobs, especially the further north and west you go in Europe. Um, but then, you have food inflation that's also been very high over there. Energy inflation was quite significant, so the living standards are squeezed. Um, and and also, and there is, I think, a divergent factor between Europe and the US, um, which is that because you have higher energy costs, you also have higher production cost. Um, you have somewhat less favorable demographics. That is to say, older age population in Europe. So, with all of these factors, I mean, it is the case that European economies are or have been more stagnant than what you find in North America. And and so then the implication is that, like, the distributional struggles are in a capitalist economy is going to be much worse in the European case. Um, I mean, the capitalist system, I mean, like, you have to grow the pie just in order to keep everybody, you know, like, content with the same resources, right? Over time. Um, The problem is, but then if the macro picture is stagnant, well, then you have a problem because then you're gonna have to bite into somebody's lunch, right? So, they're gonna say, well, okay, we have to do austerity, and we're gonna have to pick the people that will be exposed to that austerity. Um, and then, as you might know, in economic psychology, right, the loss aversion is a significant factor that where the money that you gain is going to make you less happy, is not going to make you as much happy as an equivalent amount of loss. Makes you unhappy. So yeah, so these are all factors that I don't know. I mean, they don't create a good outcome because I mean, I know in Austria the FPO they're polling at 30%. It's a nationalist party. They're the largest party now in the polls, and we're gonna have the national elections coming up in September actually. So it's not something positive to look forward to, right? I mean, and all over Europe, I mean, I think the kind of right wing is um, gonna have more influence over time. Um, I just want to say one more story about it. I saw this morning, I think in France, right, where the National Front was supposed to be invited into the government. Maybe this was just a pure rumor. Um, but so far, I mean, you might say Macron is an absolute fool, right? Because he declared like these snap elections, because he did poorly in the European elections, and then he made this electoral coalition with the left, in order to beat the National Front, the National Assembly, um, and and now the left wing faction, which is called NUPES, they won the most amount of seats, so they deserve to receive the premiership. Um, based on like the historical precedent, what they do in France, and and Macron has refused to do that appointment. Right? He's like, I'm not going to appoint anybody on the left. Um, and it's very complex because in the French political system, the prime minister is accountable to the president, right? Not to the parliament, even though in practice, I mean, the prime minister can only bring the laws forward with the support of the parliament. So, I mean, ultimately, but the appointment power is still exclusively with the president. And so basically, Macron has the perfect right to do whatever he's doing, but it is unseemly, um, because I mean now it doesn't have the support of the parliament. So I don't know what he's trying to do at this point. Um,
Neither do I. I guess my information is a bit too old. So the last time I had a conversation about the French parliamentary election, I think was almost a month ago. And it was centered around internal divisions within the left coalition to put forward their own candidate. Like Mélenchon was apparently accusing the socialists of trying to nuke every potential candidate that wasn't a member of their party, the old former leader of the French left wing. So, yeah, I'm a little
you mean
bit
the
out of the
Socialist
loop on
Party?
that one. Yeah, I'm a little bit out of the loop on that one. My articles are weeks old at this point.
Well, the latest that I've seen about Mélenchon was that he was okay. So his movement is called La France Insoumise, right? LFI,
Mhm.
and he was okay with not appointing any LFI politicians, and then not only not for the premiership, which is quite ironic because within the left coalition, his party is the biggest, right? So I mean, I mean, if he was really power hungry, he could stake the premiership, right? But he said, okay, we're not going to claim the premiership. But then Macron's position was, I don't want anybody from the LFI to be in the cabinet, right? So not just the prime minister, but in the cabinet. Um, and then the latest thing that Mélenchon brought forward was he said, okay, fine, we're not going to appoint anybody from my party into the cabinet. Um, and then he said to Macron, will you now appoint somebody from our coalition, who won the election, to become prime minister? And so far, I don't know. I mean, it seems like, I mean, Macron is not going to do it, and
That would be very foolish. Now, I get some hesitancy about the LFI because I think Macron said that they were almost as bad as Le Pen. Now, I know that that's going to trigger alarm bells, especially from anyone who's even vaguely left wing. But that was his position. So I could maybe understand the internal cordon sanitaire, like I'm not going to work with you, but no one, not even from the socialists. I mean, his party was initially founded off of a whole bunch of really unhappy voters for the Socialist Party alongside the Republicans. But the Socialists basically died while the Republicans sort of carved out a very narrow niche as a minority party. So I mean, I don't get that. I know his second term he's shifted a bit to the right, but seems a little bit weird that he would do that, even if it's just anyone vaguely left wing. I mean, he's going to end up having internal dissent from his own party at that point.
yeah, I mean, so his current prime minister, Gabriel Attal, he's kind of the liberal party, which is Macron's party, standard bearer. Um, and he was really upset about the snap polls, because he kind of knew that. So before the snap elections, there was um, um, a relative majority for Macron's party, and so they were not able to pass a lot of their like budget resolutions, but they were still able to hold the key government positions. And I think Attal kind of knew that if you do snap elections, that his party, Ensemble, is going to lose further support. And so then, I mean, the most rational thing is basically to complete the parliamentary term. Um, but I mean, it's a little bit like the gamble that Trudeau made in Canada, right? I think it was in the middle of COVID. 2 years into the term, he did the snap polls, and he lost. I mean, he lost the gamble, so he had already had a minority government with the support of the NDP, which is a little bit further to the left than Liberals. Um, and and he just lost seats in the snap polls, and after that, his government became even more dependent on the NDP, right? For electoral support. Um, so yeah, I mean, these are political gambles that you undertake, and that's certainly what Macron has done. He was really trying to call the bluff on the French electorate, where they were like, "Well, okay, you're so ready to vote for the Rassemblement, uh, in the European election. Would you do the same thing in the national polls?" And because many European voters, they regard the European election as kind of like a frustration poll, right? Where maybe it's not so much about, like, or these are the serious politicians, right? In the minds of many European voters. Um, and also it's a different electoral system, right? So it's proportionate representation in the European, and then the national election is like it's like a two-stage uh, electoral system. Um, and so that, yeah, I mean, but nonetheless, I mean, it produced outcomes that were unfavorable to Macron's party, and and Rassemblement, the right wing party, I mean, they grew anyway, right? They grew in size. Yeah, they didn't win. I mean, that certainly was the narrative in the media, in the mainstream media. But they have gained, votes. Um, Bardella, I mean, he's a young guy in the movement. Um, a- and he's got, I mean, the way how I anticipated, I mean, he's got a great future in front of him, right? Um, Now, I mean, the thing is, I mean, I mean, if you're like an astute political observer, I mean, you will know that whenever you put the right wing people in charge of the government, um, they will screw up immediately. Um, like I know the experience in Austria because we've had so many right wing governments now. Um, and every time it's usually like it takes about 2 years, 2 years into the parliamentary term, and then there's a corruption scandal that usually turns up, right? Because normally what happens, so these right wing people, they've been kept out of the power for many years, right? More than 10 years or whatever, and then when they get into office again, then they become really greedy, right? Because when you're in government, the power that you have is the appointments, right? So like the high civil service appointments, um, are going to be made by the ruling party, and in that nomination process they will appoint like technically unqualified people, um to into those positions, and then they screw up, they make mistakes, and then also yeah, and then they start taking bribes, right, by maybe powerful industrialists who receive government contracts in return and things like that. So yeah, then the whole thing starts to fall apart. Um, and and then also like when you're in power, I mean, you do have to cross the T's and dot the I's. That is to say, like your budget plans, they have to add up, right? Um, and oftentimes, I mean, the right wing, they don't do it, right? I mean, they always say they usually promise the social programs, and then they say, oh, we're gonna pay for it by cutting the politicians' salaries or something like that. Um, and when the plan doesn't add up, eventually, um, yeah, and yeah, there's going to be a lot of disappointment normally if the right wing does get into power. Um, I mean, we see this. I mean, in our case, right? Where Trump was promising these grand things. And if you look at manufacturing spending in the Trump era, I mean, it's been pretty flat, I would say. And it was a CHIPS Act, it was the Inflation Reduction Act. Um, these are all like Biden era programs, and then all of a sudden you see the infrastructure and the manufacturing spending go up after that. Um, you know, and so um, yeah, so I mean, the jobs economic record, I think, is tends to be better in the Democratic administration, um, but the self presentation, like the marketing, I think Trump is doing a better job, right? Um, like he calls it the art of the deal, right? It's like this shameless, permanent self marketing. Um, Yeah, okay, but he's doing a better job at that. But in terms of, I mean, if you look at the hard numbers, um, the much self-touted economic record of Trump was pretty bad, I would say. I mean, or it wasn't great in my view. Um, so um, yeah, so there's going to be disappointment with the right wing, but then you see, but then there's also a challenge. I mean, like if you're on a political left, right, that it's not enough to say, well, the right wingers are, stupid and incompetent. It's definitely not enough. I think that, in an electoral competition, like you have to prove that like you have better ideas, right? Um, and the left has a very, very hard time with that. Um, my analysis of the British Labour Party victory, which it was a blowout victory in terms of the seats. Um, but the statistic that I want to really hammer is actually that the Labour Party has lost voters, right? So they went from over 10 million votes to like 9.5 million, right? Um, Corbyn in his first election, I think he went to 12 million votes. Um, the Labour Party was twice as large under Corbyn than it's under Starmer. Now, okay, so then the question is, well, why is he not able to win an election then? Well, it's about the electoral behavior of the other party, right? Because when Corbyn was in power, I mean, the Conservative get like 13, 14 million votes. Under Starmer they go down to 7 million, right? So I mean, and under that system, yeah, I mean, if you can convince the conservative voters to stay home or vote for the Reform Party, which is in the Farage outfit, um, then then the Labour Party is going to win the landslide. Um, and so in terms of I mean, so if you forget about like the Corbynista like purist ideology stuff, and if you only wear the Machiavelli glasses, right, which is like how do you obtain power? Um, yeah, I do think that Starmer is going to win the gold medal, right? And so does Tony Blair, right? I mean, because it was their approach, within the British electoral system that is going to bring them victory.
Yeah. So I suppose on that front, it is a bit of an interesting uh, discussion, in large part because not only was there the destruction on the right, there was also coalition building on the left. And I mean, this is more center left because we're talking about the UK. So Labour and the Liberal Democrats deconflicted with one another as well. So I mean that also was a rather good move on their part. But it was clear that the Conservative Party was starting to enter into self-destruction. So I guess at that point, if we're talking about Machiavellian, how do you win? Maybe it's marketing your platform so that it is blandly inoffensive, but also um, that's also important for its own way, in large part because you might find diehard conservative voters that have lost their desire to vote for their party um, because it's against a more center left figure. Whereas if it were against a more Corbynite type leader,
That's
they
right.
might
Yeah,
still be able to marshal up and say, oh, we really disapprove of Sunak, who also decided to do snap elections and kind of irritate members of his own party. The announcement in the rain is something that I think a lot of people will probably be memeing for a very long time. But like they're just like between Rishi and Keir, we might be able to live with Keir and fight again the next 5 years because if we stay with Sunak, maybe the enthusiasm was so low that there was no desire for that. But if it was a more quote unquote existential threat, then there would be much more rally around the flag that could end up happening. And I mean, rallying around the flag is sort of what ended up happening inside of the French election as well. So, I mean, I know they have a different name now, but the old National Front or National Rally inside of Le Pen's group, that one was not just projected to win, it was projected to, the question was, will they have a supermajority and wipe out basically all opposition? It was like, can we just barely hold them off so that they get like 55% of the seats? Like that was the tenor of the argument prior to that. But the moment people stopped fighting with each other and the record number of three-way runoffs and four-way runoffs had its coalition, everyone was just sort of fine doing the strategic Machiavellian voting type pattern. It's not even really Machiavellian at this point, it's just strategic voting. So like we're seeing certain elements of a, when there is a big enough boogeyman, people will rally. And I think one of the things that is particularly dangerous about our politics is that a certain number of politicians, and I'm not going to name names or anything like that, because while I don't work in a government capacity, I know people who do, so I'll be a little bit careful. Uh, there are a large number of politicians that get by less by making you love them and more by making you hate and fear the other side. And that type of existential body politic is a very strong motivator. And I have had arguments with family members who have, after failing to convince me of the great qualities of their preferred political candidate, have instead chosen to demonize the opposing political candidate to the point where, oh, you can't possibly even think of doing that. Look at how terrible their actions were. You can't possibly condone that. If you're voting for them, you're voting for the worst elements of that person. But if you vote for our guy, yeah, maybe that guy isn't good, but we can live with him in a way that we can't live with the other. And I think that that
It's a
existentialism is
Carl
really the
Schmitt
problem.
logic, right? It's
We
Carl Schmitt who says that,
that
politics
German
is about fighting
philosopher.
enemies. Yeah. Um,
Yeah, fighting enemies, yes, yes. And I mean, we also got our American brand versions of that. I mean, like politics is for power and weaponizing and manipulating power to get things done is also a thing that's been around. I think there was even like Eaton Hirsch that wrote a book called Politics is for Power, literally trying to get people to just focus on winning the election. Less existential in rhetoric, but still the idea is that politics is all about making sure you're empowered to do what you want.
yeah, I was reading a colleague's paper recently, and so he studies Christian nationalist businesses in the U.S. And and so what he did was he analyzed like the self marketing of these companies, and so there's some positive framework that they're using, right? So we're in favor of like patriotism, rallying around the flag, and and a little bit of the MAGA thing, right? So make America great again. Um, but then actually the overall sentiment is actually quite negative. So that is to say that, well, you have to buy our stuff, um, because those whatever, we don't want to create like a market for liberals and baby killers, right? Abortion, whatever. So, so they construct these or like the woke mind virus, right? So they construct um these enemies, and and that's a core part of the marketing strategy, and um yeah, and I mean, okay, it's a big question whether it's like really problematic for like national social cohesion, right? I mean, does it get to a point where the demonization will result in you know, kind of like a civil war like condition. I don't know. I mean, I don't think, we're getting to that point here. I read somewhere that, like, this whole discourse around like Texas secessionism, right? Could actually be started by Russian bots, right? Bot farms. So actually, we might be back to this disinformation
And the
thing. I mean,
circle might be complete and then close, but yeah, continue.
yeah, I mean, so in that sense, yeah, I mean, like, yeah, to what extent, I mean, do we have like a discourse that could result in, internal political conflict? Um, you know, um,
So I agree with you that we are not there yet. But if we're talking about existential rhetoric and existential politics, it's a threshold about when people stop consuming it and repeating it because it has therapeutic value and start taking it as a rallying cry for some type of retributive, vicarious grievance type effect. So, like the number one, maybe not the number one of the most significant indicators for terrorist activity is vicarious grievance. That is, you take upon yourself the cause of another group and you identify with their pain and suffering so that you then motivate yourself to take action against some other in their defense or in their name. So it's very common for a lot of the more recent ISIS attacks to claim that they're doing it because of Western support for Israel and to defend Gaza. And that's not exactly a new thing. Early Al Qaeda claimed a lot of what it was doing was partially inspired by Palestine and Israel. I don't want to go down that role. I just want to mention it as a signpost. People, when they take on violent action, usually do so in the defense of another group against another. And it might be self motivated, it might be institutional, might be organizational. When you get every now and again an extremist that's willing to shoot up an abortion clinic, they are going against the doctors, the murderers, who are facilitating in the death of the unborn, the fetus, whatever you want to choose, whatever charged political language. And that's how they orient themselves. When we start getting into the realm of political assassinations, it's usually along those lines as well. Or when you get along the lines of rioting, it's usually along those lines as well. How you move from individual lone actors or flash mobs of violence to sustained conflict is a very blurry line. We are not there yet at all. And I don't want to imply that we're there yet at all. But you can sort of see this movement a little bit in the UK recently, when there was a knife attack that resulted in quite a lot of young girls dead, was then used as an impetus for a local riot because people thought people of a particular political persuasion believed that those in institutional power were actively concealing facts to protect another group. So their act of violence, their act of riot and protest, sure, like there are a lot of people, particularly if you're on the right, that would say that it was mostly peaceful. Sure, fine, whatever. But there were still several places where they burned down hotels, where they got into fights with police. Why? Why would a group that's usually considered pro police clash with police officers? Well, there's the idea that the police are partially responsible for concealing and protecting a group responsible for grooming gangs, acts of terrorism, and the death of young children. And I mean, how do you get from there to something that can blow up? And there are people that are worried that certain conditions in countries could very well lead to things blowing up and spiraling out of control. So, why bring up this and talk about this in the context of Russian information operations, which you weren't really at, but we can go over there just to close the loop because I know we've been talking for like 2 hours. So, like, why bring that up? for a very simple reason. One of the outlets that was responsible for spreading the disinformation that the perpetrator was a 17-year-old asylum seeker known to mental health authorities, a known threat ignored by people in institutional power, was a Russian linked outlet. And is that the only place where that happened? I don't know for sure. But it was certainly a contributing factor. It certainly spread the name where they got the name of the guy wrong. I mean, he wasn't an asylum seeker, he was second gen from Africa, but whatever. So it wasn't that, it was just an immediate impetus that resulted in some type of local conflagration. We've seen things on a much smaller scale happen inside the United States. You brought up Texas secessionism. There was something else. So there is the Mizzou incident, University of Missouri. There was a Russian-linked disinformation resulted in local clashes between campus protesters and the police. But we'll put that back in a container. The one that's more important is the Texas incident where there was a rally for some type of Texan national pride identity movement. And then there was a companion rally or county rally centered around a local Muslim group. And then the two formed blocs appeared at the same day in person, and there were tensions between the two of them. And the entire thing was initially oriented by a Russian social media influence campaign. Now, did that lead to sustained violence where there's an ongoing insurgency between a pro-Islamic bloc and a pro-Texan bloc? No, no, it didn't. But we are entering into a very interesting space whereby different types of collective grievance are being used to enact political effect. And we see this increasingly common in the appeals that people make and even the appeals that politicians make. And those are dangerous. Part of the reasons why I am very favorable of the Joy campaign that just came out, not to endorse a political candidate, but that's a very positive message. It is a
So
message
you
of
referring
joy.
to Kamala Harris messaging?
Yeah, I wasn't even going to say the name.
Uh,
Yeah. I am. A very
okay.
recent event for anyone who's paying attention to the news. That was a campaign of joy. Joy was on the lips of like a quarter of the speakers that I saw at the DNC talking about joy. Now, is there a more existential undertone? Does she also say that Trump is a threat to democracy and other things that could be potentially escalatory? Of course. That's the nature of politics nowadays. But I liked the idea of the positive approach, the idea of joy. And I think you're about to have a
Yeah, I
comment
mean,
on
if,
that.
if I can, like, sociologically interject here, because so the positive psychological emotions, right, of joy,
They
happiness,
aren't
contentment,
viral.
fulfillment. I mean, so all of these things, I would say, um, like, so if you think that the society is going well and it's going in the right direction, I think then you would be receptive to that positive psychological messaging. Um,
Mhm.
However, it's like if you go to the other side, which exists as well, right? So, you know, yeah, the Proud Boys. I mean, there are people who were, um, who are, I would say angry would be the psychological state. Um, and basically because they think that, well, so firstly, that the political system was rigged against them in some manner, meaning that whatever neoliberal globalization, technological change, automation, blah blah blah. I mean, whatever was the cause for the economic instability in their own lives, and then basically transfer the state of like insecurity and anger onto the political system in a way that basically how Trump communicates with the base, right? Where he's basically saying that, I'm the victim of a witch hunt, right? The Democrats are a cabal to keep me out of power, even though I deserve to win, right? So I mean that's his narrative, but I mean in a sense, I mean if you were within the Trump camp, then I mean it kind of adds up for you, right? So I mean if you look like the former Democrat, what's her name, the Hawaii Congresswoman, Tulsi Gabbard,
Tulsi Gabbard.
Tulsi
Yeah.
Gabbard, who endorsed Trump. We saw the same thing with Robert Kennedy Jr., right? Where all of the Kennedy siblings were, pro Harris, right? They were like, oh, put out a statement against what our brother is saying. Um, but but yeah, I mean, so there's quite a few figures who, if their emotional state is anger and pissed off, um, I, I would feel quite how should I say disappointed. I mean, would be the mild word about Harris
About joy.
framework. Yeah,
Sure. So I agree with that. I do. I think that goes and circles back a little bit towards what I was talking about with catharsis. Right now, when we talk about the more existential rhetoric, the agitation, the anger, the political polarization, the partisanship, the appeals that feed into those emotions result in catharsis. At least that would be my reading of it. It's this idea that they're being validated, that their concerns and their grievances are being heard. And that's something that alone will not result in violence. So I'm excluding the Proud Boys from this. I'm instead talking about just the people who are angry and think that the current system is set up against them to some extent. And if not against them, then against people that they know and love, stuff like that. So there's the cathartic, therapeutic element of this person is speaking to me in my grievances in a way that no one else ever have. And they're just as mad about the people who are responsible for this as I am. Catharsis, cathartic, therapy. It's a giant therapy circle where a bunch of people are just like, hey, I'm going to listen to this guy talk because he makes me feel good because there is something about what I have experienced or people that I know are experiencing that is not good. And like the people who are just worried saying that, oh, I have white grandchildren, will they have a future? That's the white nationalist type argument. So, I mean, sure, I get that. The thing that gets me worried is when it stops being therapy and it starts becoming a form of vicarious grievance that leads towards some call to action. So right now, I don't think that we're anywhere near political violence on any large scale. I think the rhetoric is not helpful or anything like that. But I am concerned that there could be some cause for a switch to be flipped, and it will move away from this is how I have therapy and towards there's no hope in the system anymore. The only way that we are going to get anything done is by burning the system to the ground and by having a rallying cry to do it. And this isn't an exclusively Republican thing, it's not an exclusively right wing thing. It is generalizable for almost every type of system whereby the political structure just falls apart. Right wing, left wing, center, authoritarian, or libertarian. It's a form of mass vicarious grievance that ultimately makes the enemy something associated with the state or some group associated with the state that then needs to be sought out and destroyed in order for you to be safe again. And
and
that's the
just
thing
like,
I'm worried about.
and one addition to that, I think that is so a lot of the divisive rhetoric exists on social media, and so and it basically, I mean, if I had to think about, so the Habermas theorem, right? So communicative action, right? Where basically he thought that democracy is not just about like the vote, but it's about like participating in the public discourse, and the use of speech effectively by the citizens to empower themselves. And the thing is that, so in the old days, yeah, I mean, communication was much more hierarchical. So you had to actually know, like, I don't know, a newspaper editor or some, like, TV station anchors and so forth. And you had to get a buy-in from them, and then they would interview you. They would give you, public attention. But now I'm like, okay, so I have a social media handle, and if I know how to manipulate the algorithm such that I can blow up, right? I can have wide reach. And generally, the way how to do that is usually by saying the controversial things. Because I mean, if you look at probably like the so-called political centrists, both from the center left to the center right shading, that probably are the majority of the users. But those centrist users, well, I mean, they're not going to go viral because they already hold kind of the common sentiment. I would think that the people going viral are the ones that say the inflammatory and the divisive things. And that's why, I mean, yeah, I mean, if you scroll through the social media, I mean, there's a reason why, dramatic things tend to get pushed on top of the algorithm. I mean, so, like when I share things about climate change, and every time now, if there's like some natural disaster that's happening, right, extreme rainfall, then I see that now. Um, and but I would think for if I was kind of interested in I don't know, nationalistic right wing discourse, I would probably see more of that, right? Um,
Sure.
and then it creates this impression of like, well, that the radical sentiment is the common sentiment, but that's not true, right?
Yeah. Oh, there's a lot to unpack there. So, number one, how many people are actually involved on social media in a consistent and regular basis as a fraction of the total population? As far as I'm aware, it's peaked. It's actually starting to decline, especially when you take a look at, I don't know, usage of large platforms like your Facebook, your Twitter, X, whatever. If you take a look at that, there's declining overall consistent engagement on those platforms. As in, there are fewer people, at least in the developed democracy. If it's anything, it's about attracting new users, and it's more difficult to retain old users. Like that's like one of the things. So the overall percentage of people who are regular users of social media, as in the types of people who will access it multiple times a day, what is that as a percentage of the total population? It needs to not be that. It is a majority of the population, but if we're talking about what we might think is people who are sort of terminaling online as professionals in a workforce where a lot of things are online, it's perhaps not as high as people might think, at least at first. And then there's the question of how much of that user engagement is political. Again, we're talking about a subfraction of the total amount of usage. It is perhaps not as much as people might think. Of that, how much of that activity is performative? Because one of the things that we are increasingly discovering, and it's an old concept, very old concept at this point, politics is performative. And online discourse is exceptionally vulnerable to performativity, especially when it is driven by feedback mechanisms like likes, shares, retweets, people talking about it, which means that people are inclined to have a certain type of, like, they're inclined to get up on their soapbox. And that is what they're doing. They're on their soapbox and they're talking. And then that type of soapbox, because it is performative, is likely to go into things that they think are popular. And the things that they think are popular might be the things that are controversial, especially since controversial things are popular not for the group that they're controversial towards, but because the controversy is external. It's less, I'm being provocative to the people who support me or my base. And it's more, look at how these people are being controversial so that you're more likely to watch me talk about them. And there's been a lot of research about this, a lot of market research about this on the things that drive virality, especially in political discourse. And awe is something that is very viral. This notion of experiencing awe towards something, like something is truly amazing or wonderful. Like whenever someone shows you an extraordinary feat of heroism or a beautiful landscape or something like that, alongside adorableness, the cute cat video stuff. But the thing that is the most viral are things that are motivated by hate and disgust. And you don't hate the person that's doing the virality. You hate the thing that they hate so that there is communal hatred towards that thing. Now, there's a lot of literature about this out there. I'm sure that you can drop probably like 12 of them in 5 seconds. The thing that might be relatively easily digestible to people in your audience is a YouTube video by, I think it's like a CPG Grey called This Video Will Make You Angry. It's just like, it's like 12 minutes long, and it will unpack probably an entire literature review's worth of material in just like a basic, easy to consume, like, this is one of the things that drives virality and angry emotion. So, I mean, like, there's that. And I'll pause. There's more, but I'm just going to pause right there.
Yeah, it's yeah. I would agree with most of what you said here. I think that you know, so in a way, I mean, it seems to me that your prescription to the general public is to not take the online discourse so seriously, um, uh, and um, and if we were not to take it seriously, well, then I could go back to the Harris campaign and say I'm very joyful as well, and I can be infected by the joy that you are exuding, right? And yeah, I mean, so it really,
That would be
I think
so
it does depend.
wonderful. That would be so wonderful if only that was where I was going to end with this. So, I mean, like at a big scale, part of the initial thing that you asked me was, are one of the initial things that you raised was, are we there yet? And you didn't think that you were, and I don't think that we are either. And part of that is at that big scale, I think that we aren't there. But now let's turn away from the big and go towards the small. And the small is, how do we deal with preference formation among people who are not engaging in either preference falsification or performative politics? I.e., what do we deal with the subset of people that are online terminally and consume that type of content and are shaped by that type of content and lose the ability to contrast that with something that, I don't know, like a probably anyone over the age of 25 or something like that would have, which is the ability to distinguish between different types of information ecosystems in a way that is reflective of a pre-social media landscape. I mean, yeah, Facebook was around and Twitter was around, but it was a different environment to now. Like younger Gen Z is probably that, along with Gen Alpha. So when we're talking about preference formation inside of that type of circle, how fungible are preferences and how receptive are they to certain types of performative politics? And we know that this can become an engine of radicalization. Writ large, it is not. Like for the big, great, big, wide world, people have been focusing on social media and disinformation about how it drives certain types of political preferences for forever now. And what we end up increasingly coming across to is, does Russian disinformation change votes? Turns out it's very hard to tell because the people sharing the stuff are likely to have their votes in that camp anyways. Like we can see the types of people who share and promote material. And it's difficult to tell how fungible those were to those materials, or if they were just sharing things that were part of the local domestic ecosystem, because a large part, what the Russians were saying is very similar to what everyone else was saying, and it's very difficult to establish causal linkages. In fact, there was a recent like Nature article from like within the past year that dismissed that whole notion of whether or not outside artifice was actually things shaping preferences. And you can see this alongside certain things like deepfakes, whether or not deepfakes will change anything. That is a can of worms that we have no time to talk about right now. But there's a broader question of whether or not this is driving large change. But if instead we're talking about driving smaller changes among individual people, that's different. Especially, maybe not just individual people, but small groups that can potentially engage in collective action at a micro level. And that is where we end up getting certain amounts of local political violence, local political extremism, and potentially in the future, a source of assassination attempts. And that is this subset of people that buy into performative existential politics, and they don't take it as performative, they take it as literal. Because if you literally believe in existential politics, other political parties are not rivals for power. It's not good democratic governance. Their very existence is a threat to you and yours. And if they are an existential threat and not just an existential point of rhetorical eloquence, not just a way to galvanize the base, make them feel good and vote for you, but instead actually convinces people that these are tyrants. This is a cabal of cannibalistic pedophiles. You end up getting a guy shooting up a pizzeria. Or if you literally believe that a certain Republican candidate is the most immediate precursor to fascism that we're ever going to get, and that if he wins, democracy is over in America and everyone's going to be put into camps, then that's how you get someone who wants to shoot him at a rally. The moment you move away from performativity and towards real existential belief, you get out of that space of therapy and you move towards the sense of vicarious grievance. And once you get there, or at the very least existential grievance, once you get there, things start looking much, much worse. And we don't necessarily know how this balance works. So it might just be that performativity for people an hour a day, no one really cares. It does nothing to them. If anything, they might not even care about politics anymore. And after 5 years, we might get the horse from Animal Farm saying, this is no better or worse than it's ever been before. Irrespective of whether or not it's actually worse, they're just going to be like, politics has always been like this. We're just going to move on. And that might be the unmotivated mass of people in the center, an apolitical force that, as bad as things appear, they're going to think that it's been this way for forever. Like, whatever. The people who buy out. The people who like to just say that I'm just grilling here as far as the meme is concerned, because the centrist griller is probably very popular among people under the age of 30. But like, anyways, like that type of approach. But that's not everyone. There's some marginal faction for which things could lead towards certain elements of danger. And every now and again, you get people who are very keenly aware of their own minority status. And at that point, they'll bring up the notion of there's a certain nobility in resistance. Like the 3%ers extremist group, anti-government, anti-institutional, relative extremist group. They believe that the American Revolution was won by only 3% of the population. So if only 3% of the local population is willing to join them in their militia group, that's all they need to win a new American Revolution, take down tyranny, and reestablish democracy in their view, whatever that actually means. And at this point, you might need a DHS, FBI expert to go into the local domestic extremism rabbit holes. But you get to that point, and at that point, I lose my ability to really think about things. So when a politician's up on stage talking about things that are not true, Is that a threat to democracy on its own? Of course not. Politicians have lied for forever. I did the horse thing again. Politics has always been like this. Lying has always been part of it, but yeah, lying it seems to be a whole lot more common now. Compared to what? Compared to 10 years ago, 20 years ago, not compared to the age of the yellow press, like way earlier. But now, yeah, we're in a point where there's an increased problem relating to truth. And this gets into this notion of truth decay, the collapse of a common sense of reality in politics, which is its own thing. And there are people at Rand working on that, which I would recommend people take a look at some point. But the overall thing that I'm getting at is the performativity on its own isn't a problem. People falsify their preferences all the time too. So it could be that a politician is lying about an opposition figure to an audience that is exaggerating their own preferences to have some type of crowd effect so that when it comes into context with reality, it no longer really holds meaning. Now, this is something that we can sort of observe in modern political partisan politics right now, but it was something that was true in the Soviet Union. There was the old joke that, um, like, there's this notion of people pretending to work and pretending to be fed or be paid. And then there's this broader notion of everyone inside the communist system knew it wasn't working, but everyone couldn't tell their friends that they knew it wasn't working. So they all just lied to each other about how great everything was,
Yeah.
right up until the first opportunity came to throw the system out. And then almost everyone did. So, I mean, we don't know what world we're in, though. Are we in the world where this performative existentialism can be treated as a communal lie that everyone just sort of agrees because that's just politics? And by communal lie, I'm actually, that's a bit darker than what I'm actually implying. A better way to put it is kayfabe, the wrestling mania storyline thing. Like you're believing in a thing in its truthiness, but you know that it's an exaggerated display on real life and that the matches are sort of not really real, like kayfabe type politics. Is it that type of thing? Or is there an internal element that is indistinguishable from the kayfabe that won't reveal itself until a certain point happens and then violence occurs? And I don't know. I have literally no idea. So while on a whole I'm positive, at a micro level, I see too many avenues for things to go bad. So I love the joy element because it is so incongruous to a politics of existential fear and dread that I'm hoping that it might do some cognitive dissonance work with anyone who's potentially like on the cusp of that extremism pathway.
Yeah, but
But I've been talking now for like 10 minutes, so I'll shut up.
if you're at that cliff, I don't know whether you're willing or open-minded to consider the joy element. When you talk about communal lie, kayfabe, I mean, I'm thinking about Harari, right? And he basically argues that the Israeli historian that myth is basically what drives all of human behavior. So in a way, the fact that we are willing to embrace like myths around like the foundation of the country, right? Or the foundation of Christianity. And so these are things that it almost goes back to this Nietzschean point, right? Where it's like people accept suffering as long as they see purpose in it, right? And so or instead of suffering, I mean, you might say, well, any kind of negative experience. And and so yeah, I mean, and we have to tell ourselves a myth, a story that could be real conceivably, but it's only real if we hold it in our minds to be real. In sociology, I mean, we have the term self-fulfilling prophecy, and that's kind of one of the like one of the core terms, discipline. Um, because if you ask a philosopher, like an ontologist, what is real, and you have like 40 different definitions, depending on what in philosophical tradition you're from. Um, in sociology, it's very simple. I mean, we think, real is whatever the actors said we study think is real. Um, and so, yeah, so if people believe that, or there's a witch hunt on this political leader, um, yeah, then it becomes real to them. And then the actions that they're undertaking, like January 6th, for instance, I mean, it's going to be quite real and has real impacts. Now, okay, so we talked a lot about like, okay, so there are you could say the commoners who are, you know, participating in truth decay and misinformation and things like that. But then I saw this headline this morning. It was about, I think, Mark Zuckerberg, right? He's saying that, he was pressured by the government on COVID messaging. Um, and so the people that are quite skeptical about um, government narrative, right? I mean, they could take this headline and they could just say, well, okay, it's not just uh, malicious individuals that are trying to misinform me, but the people in power as well, right? I mean, they are not being nice and transparent, and if they were trying to suppress discourse and information, um, like, I mean, like, over here in the podcast, we don't have to worry about it because, I don't get enough views to be monetized. So I think we can speak our minds here. Yeah, basically, there is a lot of, you could say, not just from individuals, misinformation, but the people in power. I mean, they have an interest to also control the discourse because they are afraid, like going back to the kayfabe terminology that you used, they're afraid that somebody says the emperor has no clothes. Somebody says that, hey, this kayfabe, whatever performance that we are undertaking, um, is totally groundless, and I'm not going to trust anything that comes from a powerful official, right? Um, and okay, so I don't want to do baby with the bathwater. So I'm not saying everything that the government does is nonsense, and don't take your vaccine and things like that. I think that's trying to go too far in one direction. Um, but partially, I'm willing to walk with the people that are saying that not just individuals out there, also the people in power are trying to control discourse, and not wanting to be um, told off. So yeah, so there are, I think, legitimate concerns about power as well, right?
Sure. I think that it's always a wise idea to maintain some degree of skepticism towards instruments of national power that have some type of unhappy effect on politics. So, if control or regulation over one thing may lead to a temptation to do something for political advantage, then every now and again actions will be under scrutiny, regardless of whether or not they were done with the best of intentions or with mercenary intentions. On a whole, I am far more positive on government and government institutions particularly around the professional class of people that make up civil servants. I have a very high degree of confidence in those people. I've met hundreds of them over the past decade or so. And I think on average and on the whole, they get a whole lot of stuff right. Most things right, but they don't get everything right. People make failures, people make mistakes. And the more powerful you are, the more consequential your mistakes are. The more powerful you are, the more weight there is to your wrongdoings. And we've seen this in ordinary politics. We've seen this in the management of the economy. We've seen this even in war. I mean, it is not beyond the imagination for people to say that certain things about the withdrawal from Afghanistan were handled poorly and people died as a result, including a lot of our local allies that were left behind. And more immediately relevant to the types of people who are going to be skeptical of power, we got a lot of things wrong in the post 9/11 world, where we thought that there were certain things that were true that were not. You mentioned at some point, and maybe this was prior to the start of the conversation, that there was someone who did an investigation of the lead up to the war in Iraq. There were definitely mistakes made in that front, and there were a great deal of mistakes made after the war was started, to the point where certain things were locked into path dependencies that resulted in far more harm than might needed to have ever have occurred if the initial approach was done with clear eyes and the benefits of hindsight, certainly with regards towards the things that were false, i.e., most of what Curveball said when he informed spy agencies inside the United States and Europe. So, I mean, plenty of mistakes happen there. And there's almost always the temptation for political leaders to lie at some point. One of the most famous instances of a lie is something that has almost nothing to do with ordinary people's lives. That was Bill Clinton saying he had no sexual relations with Monica Lewinsky. That clip will be aired until we have turned to dust. But what is that about? It is a denial of a sexual encounter, a liaison, a form of adultery between one of the most powerful men on planet Earth at the time and an intern, which is gross in its own way, but it's not a thing that necessarily would result in people feeling like they need to doubt institutions or the president or anything like that. Where I think we're getting a little bit more dangerous, not dangerous, in more dangerous territory, is the selective use of highlighting areas of institutional and personal failings of people in power as evidence against a broader whole. Was there pressure against certain social media campaigns related to COVID-19? I don't think that that's actually news to people who are paying attention. But maybe it is news for people who are paying attention. There was a desire to promote things in the name of public safety. At the time, people were making the best judgments they had with the information they had available to them. And they may not have been nearly as open to countervailing viewpoints as they should have. And there was a large host of foreseeable disasters that people could have saw coming a mile away, like lack of educational attainment in the long term, among young children in particular, the potential for increased rates of social and mental illness, large increasing rates of suicide ideation and drug dependency. Everyone could have saw that a mile away because people did see that a mile away. I remember talking about them like a month into the COVID pandemic. People knew that, but people were making different decisions, decisions that they believed were rational at the time, which was if you believe that COVID-19 is as severe a pandemic as it didn't turn out to be, but if you thought that it was likely to be a much more existential, damaging type plague pandemic, then you would have taken certain measures and methods to prevent and curtail something much worse. And now that we're in a year or two out of the pandemic even mattering, because it stopped mattering a while ago, as much as regulations persist, And as much as people are still dying of it fairly regularly, I mean, it's not like COVID-19 went away, it's just no longer as much of an issue. As we now have the ability to see daylight and realize that we made mistakes and it is now safe to admit our errors, the people who were pressured by those errors are increasingly comfortable coming out. I mean, Mark Zuckerberg is one of the most powerful people on planet Earth. Do you think that a month into the pandemic, he wouldn't have been able to tell people that there might have been some pressure on certain viewpoints being suppressed related to the pandemic? Of course not. He could have done it the very next day. The reason why it's as late as it is because it's a bit of a acknowledgement of a mistake, one that in retrospect we can acknowledge. And I don't know the exact details of it, but the generalities of it is something that I don't find all that surprising. So
Yeah, to be honest, I mean, like
putting
if
it
I
in
was
that,
like
but
an
sure.
yeah, if I was
Yeah.
an official, I mean, yeah, I have a very hard time like going really hard against the people in power with respect to COVID because I remember back then when there was a debate about the vaccine mandates, um, at the beginning, right, when the vaccine came out, uh, I was on the side of the officials, which is to say, I was in favor of mandating the vaccine because I was misinformed effectively in the same way as they were, which is that that if you take the vaccine, then you can reduce the. It was not about stopping the infection, but it was about reducing the severity of the
Reducing
disease
severity. Yeah.
and reducing the death rate and in that way, we can more quickly go back to normal, so to speak. And I thought that the people that were against the vaccine were kind of hindering that process. So I accepted the same argument as the officials, and so that's why I mean, the Monday morning quarterbacking is difficult for me as well. Because because I would have done the same decision if I was in their shoes. But then yes, I mean, if you do retrospectively, you're like yes, I mean, firstly, I mean, there are some people who are getting vaccine injured. I think there's absolutely no doubt about it. Um, and you know, and not taking up the vaccine, um, you know, it does not necessarily result in death, right? I mean, it's not like a slam dunk thing. So if people wanted to say, "Oh, I'm just going to risk it. I have natural infection, natural immunity," um, that probably would have been a politically acceptable decision looking back at it, right? And hence
Yeah.
the vaccine mandate would have been, you know, you could say, big government mistake, so to speak. I mean, if you accept the libertarian framework. Um, so I so yeah, so it's very hard to do the Monday morning quarterbacking on the specific subject. Um, but again, but there's legitimate critique of the people in power. Now, the difficult thing is that we're going to have a new crisis. It's only a matter of time, I suppose. And it's like,
Yeah.
is there like a particular, so like the important resource in politics, right? It's not measured by money. It's measured by trust, effectively, right? And if the overall stock of trust that the population has with respect to people in power, I mean, if it's very low, I mean, then when the crisis strikes, it's a big question. Like, will the trust return to a level that we're able to deal with
Well, I
the
mean,
problem effectively, or will it stay
that's one
low?
of the yeah, I mean, that's one of the more dangerous things that we need to think about because trust might come back and it might not. And this is something that I remember having a conversation with someone who way more decorated career wise than I am, way more established. She did a whole lot more stuff, older too. Her idea was that, of course, we will, because the moment there's a crisis, people have a rally around the flag effect. People will reset and default on their trust metrics because people are willing to do stuff. And yeah, people will remember past screw ups, and the past screw ups will be bad. But ultimately, people will end up making a certain sacrifice and call because that's what it is to be a nation. And this was agnostic about the future crisis. Would it be another pandemic, or would it be a potential act of war, like another 9/11 type event? Uh, just a generalized crisis, like will we be able to sustain future crises given deficits inside of trust? I am skeptical because I believe that while it's certainly possible to tell that story in a convincing way, there's a whole aperture for doubt to seep back into the system. And I think that people will have fear of dissent being a potential threat vector for division. And that might invite bad calls by people in power. And I'm not going to get too specific on that one, just because of the people I work with and stuff like that. But I will say that I'm not entirely sure the trust will bounce back. It can, certainly. And I think that it is more likely to bounce back in areas that have nothing to do with pandemics. But I will say that there are some people that have said the exact opposite, which is trust is now down so much with regards towards faith in the CDC among certain elements of the public that if a future pandemic occurred, we wouldn't be able to effect even half as successful a quarantine procedure as we did after COVID-19. And that is bad because COVID-19 was both a blessing and a curse. It was a blessing because it was not nearly as dangerous as we thought it was. And it became increasingly less lethal with time, to the point that your children will probably think of it as nothing worse than a particularly bad flu if they get it, large part because certain markers of immunability are partially inheritable. But anyways, the other thing behind that is, was it a blessing because it wasn't that bad? Yeah. But that also makes it a curse because people took actions and steps thinking it would be worse. And because of that, there is a potential problem there because people might not be inclined to think that the next one will be bad because they were told that COVID-19 was going to be potentially really horrible, and it ended up not being. So if we end up getting something worse in the future, will people believe it? And I think the most important thing here is trust, yes, but time. We need time to pass for people to forget the institutions getting things partially incorrect about COVID-19. Because the moment people start to forget, or at the very least move on, the more likely they'll be willing to give it a second chance, at least among the more anti-institutional crowd. The institutional crowd, pandemic happens tomorrow, that's bad. It's just like, okay, good news. I have a box of masks somewhere in my basement or in a cupboard, and I can just take it out and use it. I have like 14 different hand sanitizers that never got opened. I'm prepared. It's the
So,
anti-institutional crowd I'm worried about.
so you're saying like, make kayfabe great again. That seems to be the
Oh
it seems to be a
no,
big takeaway message to the public.
no, that's
Oh,
terrible. But if we're
yeah.
talking about the collective myth of certain institutions needing to be trustworthy as a bulwark against potential disaster, then yeah, I firmly believe that we need a trust in our Department of Defense, not for increasingly marginal counter extremism efforts in certain parts of the world that 95% of the country can't even point on a map. I mean, Do I think that we should be doing stuff like that? Arguably, yeah. But is that the reason why I think that we need to have trust in the Department of Defense? No. I think that we need to have trust in the Department of Defense because there is a potential that there might be war in the future. Why do we need to trust in our intelligence communities? The FBI, the CIA, those folks. Why do we need to trust in them? Because of certain bad actors being bad guys around the world, potentially causing harm? Arguably, sure, but that's not going to be the thing that motivates ordinary people to trust in those institutions. It's about the potential for existential threats, penetrating certain types of systems, and causing precursors to some type of strategic surprise, some type of future 9/11 event, or some type of future state action that could cause problems. Why do we need a trust in the Treasury? Not because I think that there are certain elements inside of the USTR. No, that's a different one. Certain elements inside of a certain economic policy that needs absolute fealty. Of course not. But you need to have some trust in the Treasury and the Fed and the US Department of Commerce because at a whole micro level, that's the management of the economy. If you don't even vaguely trust in that, then your participation in everyday ordinary economic life is basically founded on nothing. So you do need to have certain elements of trust in institutions in order for them to work. And they do need to be worthy of your trust in order for that to happen. And one of the things that I can safely say is that US institutions are incredibly trustworthy, not perfectly trustworthy, not be uncritical of everything that they ever do because
I
it's
mean,
always done with
compared
your
to like
personal
a
best interest.
developing global south country, right?
But compared to elsewhere, yes, yes, yes. It's not even a contest.
Yeah.
When people talk about deep states in the United States, I'm just like, have you heard of Turkey or Pakistan or anywhere else where they actually have those things? So, I mean,
Yeah, I
sure.
mean, I have to say, like, it's the facts on the ground that can change people's opinion, right? So I mean, just for instance, like, okay, I've had quite a negative take on the military-industrial complex in this country. Let me just state that. And fortunately, I don't take contracts from them. So, but that was um because my take, because I was socialized in the early 2000s and in the 2010s, and so I'm really, you could say, the Iraq War generation. I think we're quite close in age, maybe, so we have the same reference point here. And so I always had the impression that you know the US really abused this Fukuyamian, like
The end of history, my
post
friend.
history moment, right? And was using their, like, kind of, like, unilateralism power to basically beat up you know weaker countries that are opposed in some manner to the US order. um and I held that view quite firmly until the the large scale Russian invasion, right? And then I think it was like when that happened, then it was like a switch that was flipped. Now, I mean, of course, the Ukrainians, they would say, well, I mean, actually, you'd have to go back to 2014 and whatever, but the Maidan event, Crimea, but oh yeah, it wasn't as high priority back then. But after that event, I was sort of on board now with U.S. military industrial complex, and now actually I'm quite grateful that the defense industrial complex is going to pump weapons into Ukraine, and so and yeah, we should have those capabilities, and it just changes because the facts on the ground, right, were changing, right? So if you shift from, I mean, the story in Iraq and Afghanistan was, in my view, that the U.S. was, abusing this liberal hegemony idea too much. And but the narrative around Ukraine, I think, is the opposite, where it's like, okay, now we have to defend this liberal order, and you cannot defend it with words. I mean, you need weapons for that. So um, now, okay, but then if you have a topic like Israel, for instance, now I think that makes it much more complicated again, because because some people say, well, Israel is a U.S. ally, we have to protect them no matter what. Look what happened October 7. But then it's kind of going the opposite way, where if you sign the blank check to Netanyahu to basically go and flatten Gaza, right? You just kill 40,000 people and counting, right? Uh, you know, eh, Completely destroying all of the universities, hospitals, infrastructure. Um, and and the U.S. is actively supporting that. Now, so I'm not saying that there were easy decisions, for the Israeli government, because you have to do something, following these Hamas attacks. Um, but it is the disproportionality, right? That is problematic. So yeah, I mean, with the Israeli case, I mean, I'd be very cautious again you know um
There
about
are
the
a
U.S.
lot of
policy
people who
position.
are there are a lot of people who are unhappy with Israel's handling of the conflict. A lot of people. There's especially a certain amount of discontent within the current administration uh, with regards towards that. I won't go too far into it, but what I will say is that power asymmetries make it difficult to sustain support for the ones who are very clearly in possession of the upper hand. Because the longer that ends up ongoing, the more you develop sympathies for the underdog in the conflict, especially when they are on the receiving end for a decent amount of punishment. And you can sort of blur the lines between the militant force doing the resistance and the local civilian population. So, I mean, if Israel could get away with only targeting Hamas and not a civilian, and this was October 10th, no one would bat an eye at what they're doing. But because it's difficult to distinguish, and there are a lot of civilian casualties, and the ways in which the war is conducted has resulted in immense destruction of infrastructure, a complete collapse of the socioeconomic order, as well as the ability to ensure that food and medical supplies enter into the area. That has made it very difficult to sustain support for Israel, even among people who are traditional supporters of Israel. We're seeing divisions of that right now in the Democratic Party at the moment. The Republican Party is still pro Israel, but the Democratic Party is not split because the current administration is pro Israel. And all indications are that uh, Vice President Harris is as well. But there's increased skepticism. So when you were talking about the degree to which you trust it, supporting Israel is not the same as supporting Ukraine. Wanting a defense industrial complex that can support Ukraine, resist Russia, is much more easily done and persuadable for people than supporting Israel. I do know that quite a lot of people would disagree with that notion quite strongly, especially from certain elements of the political spectrum, but it is there and it's uncontroversial, especially especially if all you're doing is noting it, noting that there are people who find that disagreement. That's completely uncontroversial. One thing that I will say, and right now I'm actively thinking about whether or not I should say it. One of the things that I will say is that some of this is also not just, some of this is made worse by Netanyahu himself. So, in one of the more recent ceasefire negotiations, according to a podcast that I listen to that you can get if you're a member at War on the Rocks. So I don't know if anyone's interested in that. But in that podcast, there was a discussion, very brief, 10-minute discussion. And Netanyahu introduced two things for a condition for a ceasefire that were previously not part of the prior ceasefire negotiations. And I might get the exact specifics wrong because I'll need other sources for that. But my inclination, my memory is that Netanyahu wanted more complete control over the border between the West Bank and Egypt. And they wanted the ability to control certain reentry, especially to restrict reentry from people who have Hamas membership. And those two things are currently unacceptable to the Hamas fighters inside of Gaza. Now, open question. Does Gaza actually represent the West Bank? Sure. Open question. Whether or not that makes them the right negotiation partners, also open question. Lots of people have found the notion of negotiating with them not exactly the best thing in the world. But the United States is very clear. We are supportive of a ceasefire, and the ceasefire is not some nebulous Israel and the Palestinian people, but an actual end of hostilities between the two fighting factions at the moment. And we are very much supportive of that right now. But that support for a ceasefire does not mean that there's simultaneous disapproval of continuing aid to Israel. There was some elements of restrictions, and in the ways in which it is difficult to see because this is all behind the scenes, there's been very clear tension between Washington and Tel Aviv, especially about controlling and moderating Israel's intentions. So you'll notice that the casualty rates, those figures, they've gone way down. Like most of those initial estimates, one, where the number's accurate, whatever, we'll give that to someone else. But the number hasn't ticked up at nearly as fast a rate over the course of the past 6 months at this stage than it did during the first few months. And that has to do, in some part, due to pressure to constrain a willingness to engage in action that can result in a lot of civilian casualties.
Yeah, I mean,
And some of
because
that also has to do with Hamas actually sort of losing most of what they had too. So a mixture of both of them.
yeah, but okay, I mean, if I was this, I mean, I'm not Palestinian, but if I was kind of putting myself into their skin here, it kind of sounds cynical, right? I mean, to say that, well, okay, the U.S. Is persuading Israel to be a little bit less harsh, right? But nonetheless, I mean, harsh enough to kill enough people, right? I mean, and then that's not really great solace, right? I mean, what
Fewer dead people is a good thing, but it is still dead people.
that's
And
right.
the
Yeah,
fact,
that
so
still quite sounds quite cynical. So I mean, I agree with the kind of the more left position, I guess, the Bernie Sanders position, which is that I think the weapons flow would have to stop up to the point that you see you know like the ending of the bombing, right, and the ending of the war, and okay, so then I understand. Okay, so there would be the Israeli discourse where they say, well, okay, then we don't feel protected, and Hamas going to come back, and they're going to strike us again. And look, so in terms of defensive military equipment, um, so the Iron Dome system would be the main one, but I mean, I'm not a military expert. I mean, military experts know better than me, but I think defensive equipment, I think, is perfectly justifiable to be sent into Israel. I mean, because they're, I mean, they're also chewing. against a lot of enemies at this point, right? I mean, they were striking in Iran, they were fighting the Lebanese, like the Hezbollah, right? Then there's rockets from the Houthis in Yemen and stuff. So in terms of defensive equipment, I would say yes. I think that the U.S. should be there, um, but with respect to anything that would help them prosecute the ground war in Gaza, I would be very much opposed to that. But yeah, you know, but again, the people in power here, I mean, they think, well, no, you have to show the unreserved support, um, and uh, you know,
You're definitely
and
not
maybe
the
we
only
can just
one who's had that position at all. Uh, there is an article by Ryan Evans fairly early on in the Israeli commencement of Israeli operations inside of the West, inside of Gaza. And it was very highly critical. And the reason why I'm pointing out Ryan Evans is because he is sort of in charge of one of the more well respected and certainly more well read defense policy, national security, academic world. So he is um, related to War on the Rocks. He's related to the Texas National Security Review, its academic arm. And it was very critical of Israeli action. I'm bringing that up just to say that there is strong dissent in certain parts of even the traditional defense policy practitioners, not even needing to get to Bernie Sanders. So there is that. I'll only say two things before we close on this. One is, while there is some equipment that is very easy to determine whether or not is for the offense or for the defense, most military equipment does not easily distinguish between the two. And it is difficult to prevent a country from gaining offensive capabilities without damaging their defensive capabilities. Like, here's an obvious example. You have a gun and it has bullets. The bullets are the same regardless of whether or not you're shooting someone who is trying to attack you and kill you in your own home, or if you are engaging in
going
an
out
act
and
of
killing
armed
a bear.
robbery in another house. Yeah. So, I mean, it's difficult to tell. And this is especially true for certain types of drones, like FPV drones. You can use those for your self defense, or you could use them to literally turn them into something along the lines of personnel chasing single use missiles. I mean, just to use the Russia Ukraine war as an example. It's difficult to tell sometimes. Now, if you were given enough time, I'm sure you could come up with a list of things not to give Israel if that was your chosen prerogative. But that leads into the second problem. The conflict is not Israel and Gaza alone. Israel has been exchanging in fires with Lebanon recently. And there was a real chance of a regional escalation of the conflict. Now, granted, quite a lot of people have been trying to prevent that, but how they prevented it is a sort of intra-war deterrence mechanism to bring things back to Ukraine. How do you fight without escalating, essentially? Or how do you escalate just enough to show that you're serious without risking another full-blown war? And if you're looking for a case of this dance playing out, very deadly and dangerous dance, you can see it right now between uh, roughly Iran affiliated groups neighboring Israel and Israel right now. Which means that if you were to prevent the arrival of new military equipment to Israel, that destabilizes the intra-war deterrence mechanism because Israel's ability to carry on the conflict, if it escalates, becomes somewhat damaged. Now, I have full confidence that if people were serious enough to temporarily pause some weapons shipments to Israel, that if there was some future attack against Israel, those weapons and supplies would go back. But that's a delay. And how long is that delay?
Yeah,
Is
well,
that
I
delay
mean,
measured in
I
hours, days, weeks, months, whatever? And it's a difficult thing to really pace out. Now, I understand there's still reasons to be skeptical of that type thing, but it's undeniable
yeah. So I mean, I don't think there's any direct threat on Israel.
at the
In terms,
moment. No.
yeah. So well, because the U.S. has been playing the cover. I mean, but that's been the case since the founding of Israel. So last 75, 80 years. Um, I mean, as long as the U.S. is saying that the bilateral alliance is in place, um, I don't see a direct threat to the state of Israel from like Iran and affiliates. Uh, yeah, I mean, there's gonna be some level of firing, but I of rockets, but I was very skeptical of the Hamas and Hezbollah leader assassinations. Um, because I mean, because okay, when you're not tripling these organizations, I mean, they do have second in command, third in command, and so forth. So, and at the same time, I mean, you are just like forcing some kind of response from Iran and the affiliates. So, um, yeah, I think that this whole like escalatory logic within the Middle East is problematic, and here the U.S. is in a more problematic position, morally speaking, I would say, because again, in Ukraine, okay, you can say you're defending the defending power, um, but but Israel, I mean, I mean, in October the 7th, yeah, I mean, okay, they were the victims, but then basically all the events happening after that date,
When does
I
defense become the offense?
they
So
they become the perpetrators. So now the U.S. is in a position to whatever they do on behalf of Israel now becomes about defending the I guess the offense, right? The offense in a negative sense. Um, and so well, I mean, and what are the tools that the U.S. administration has? I think it's about the weapons, really. I mean, the weapons supply to Israel. I think that's the short term lever that the U.S. has, and it would be uh it would be quite effective, I think.
sure, if we're taking a look at a prescribed problem set, i.e., you want to enforce some type of peace now. Um, what is the main element of U.S. leverage over Israel, in addition to lots amount of goodwill and previous alliance relationships and personal ties? It is economic and military ties. And I mean, like sanctions are impossible. I know that there have been a couple of people, particularly among the more Marxist form of the left, that have talked about sanctions. Those will never happen in a million years, at least not under this administration or the next one. But if we're talking about cutting off military assistance, that has some purchase in some circles. And there have been people that have said that a cutting off of military aid and assistance to Israel would result in a ceasefire. They've said it. There are a few people who disagree, especially Netanyahu. Uh, but it's a position that people have. And at the very least, for the people who are concerned about moral culpability, it does make them feel like they're making the more moral choice. Sure. I will, it's difficult to have this type of discussion because it is one of the more partisan and personal ones that exists right now in a way that the Russia and Ukraine war never was. Like at the moment, people have lost friendships over taking different positions over the Gaza conflict. And I've had plenty of conversations about it, including with a fellow Cook scholar who is very much more in your camp than mine when it comes to Gaza. But I will just say that sometimes defense can transition into offense. But when things are personal, it is difficult for people to acknowledge that that transition has taken place. And if you talk to a certain subset of people, the Gaza war is defensive, and any suggestion that it is not defensive is borderline fighting words. And the example that I've heard used is the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor. Almost all of the fighting between the US and Japan after the initial naval engagements took place in either Japanese occupied territory or Japan, including the fire bombings and the use of nuclear weapons. Now, granted, I'm sure that is a losing argument to you because I'm willing to bet that you think that the nuclear weapons were perhaps not good to be used. But their argument would essentially be that it was a defensive war. At no point did the United States invade Japan. It was never an offensive conflict. It was all fallout from the attack on Pearl Harbor, a day that will live in infamy. And October 7th is their day that will live in infamy, their version of 9/11. And every action that they're taking right now is directly tied to that. And all actions they take are meant to preserve some type of post peace scenario. And the eradication of Hamas should be seen as no different from the eradication of Nazism instead of Germany. So that things don't end when you bomb Dresden, you need to go in and take Berlin. Now, do I agree with that? No. But it is an argument that needs to be wrestled with,
Yeah, I mean it's a tough
especially when we're talking about
metaphor.
defense.
It's very tough metaphor because I mean in both cases, Germany, Japan, I mean they became sovereign countries again after the war. I mean even with U.S. military occupation, and they're you know you could say first world, rich, right, democratic. I mean all of the features that we regard as desirable. And yeah, in Gaza, I mean, it's it's made into a third world. I mean, it was already a poor country, and of course, it's made much more desperately poor through the bombing and destruction. So, um, and I mean, if you look at the demographics, right, that region, historic Palestine, which includes Israel and West Bank and Gaza, um, is demographically divided roughly evenly, right? So, half Jews, half Arabs, Palestinian. So, I mean, so the future has to be, I mean, if we exclude the option of genocide, which, I mean, some people say it's already happening, but
Hope so. Hope so.
um,
That's a no-go.
yeah, yeah. So if we exclude that option, and I would also, um, and there were some people who were saying, well, let the Palestinians, move into like a Western country or something, right? Which I mean, they do have a large diaspora in Western countries already. Um, but I also don't think that this is necessarily a fair solution. So, so you exclude expulsion, you exclude genocide. Well, then what is the future? Well, the future is that you're going to have an evenly split demographic region, and you're going to have to find an arrangement. I mean, whether it's two state or whether it's like one state that's secular. um that's the only way out. I mean, it's not a massive a bombing campaign. and doing that for the next 100 years. I mean, I don't see this to be the
It's not a
I mean,
sustainably good outcome, that's for sure.
yeah, I mean, it's not even good for the Israelis, right? I mean,
No,
themselves. So,
not even close.
so I mean, so a future would have to be, um, it would have to be a house that both sides are building together. I mean, what else are you gonna do, right?
At a certain point, it does have to. I'm reminded of a quote that I think was from Napoleon, but it could have been someone else. You can do anything with a bayonet except sit on it. The basic idea behind that is that warfare and the tools of war don't serve any purpose, not any purpose. They don't serve the type of purpose that you would want in a post-conflict type scenario. You can't sit on the bayonet. If you're using a weapon like that, you can only use it to continue to fight. So, I mean, that's especially true inside of any type of ongoing, enduring conflict. At a certain point, you need to put aside the bayonet, I suppose, in this type of situation. And I think in the future, that's something that will desperately need to happen. For now, though, we are in an intractable type of the conflict where long-term peace seems out of the question. So right now, I'll just settle for a way to get a desirable and lasting ceasefire and then try to build peace after.
Right. So I mean, and the U.S. strategy is, I mean, wait until even the Israelis are exhausted, and then throw in the towel. And yeah, I don't know. I mean, again, it's like I do think the U.S. has the tools to expedite the process. But anyway, so okay, I think we had the 3 hours, so I think we'll call this to an end. But as I always like to quote Billy Joel, we didn't start the fire. It was always burning since well, it's been turning. And certainly, I mean, if you talk about conflict, that song should be in our minds. Which is another way of saying, I'll get you on the next podcast, and we'll find
Sure thing.
we'll find world peace at the end of the next podcast, hopefully.
Sounds good. Looking forward to it.
Okay, that's great. Thank you for joining me here, Dennis.
Thank you
And
for having me on.